So thank you for joining this presentation. Today I'm joined by my colleagues Joshua Wong, Dana Burfiend, and we will be covering our approach to supporting students to develop confidence and achieve success in their science units through a blended model of support as we navigate the uncertainty of the pandemic. So, as scientists and educators, we appreciate and acknowledge the inherent value of lab-based learning experiences to develop confident and skilled STEM graduates. This is certainly not new information, and the laboratory remains the cornerstone of the undergraduate science experience. But of course, what happens when COVID happens? The pandemic has massively disrupted university education around the world, and the initial response being to move teaching off campus with students learning online at home. So in July last year, we conducted a survey to understand how our colleagues around the world were adapting their teaching and learning practices in light of the shift to online learning. We heard from 35 academic staff, mostly based in Australia, New Zealand, and the USA, from the disciplines of biology and chemistry, where laboratory or field-based activities are a core element of the learning. Importantly, we found that all educators made changes to adapt their courses for remote learning. So recognizing how important the experimental element is for moving from recall to application of knowledge and deeper understanding, many of our colleagues cited adaptations, including videos of techniques, use of equipment and resources to support remote learning. And this includes the provision of existing data sets for students to use for write-up. Fewer respondents, however, actually cited examples of adaptations that supported the retention of hands-on learning. So this includes changing the staff to student ratio where on-campus learning was able to return, and the provision of materials and resources for at-home experiments to complement the learning. It's really important to consider the context in which these responses were collected. This rapid shift to online learning is referred to as an emergency remote teaching. Now, Hodges and his colleagues have reported that these adaptations often took place in the absence of substantial support from someone with expertise in online learning. And this would be the norm for courses that are offered fully online. The reality is these changes weren't meant to be permanent. And with the affordance of time and learning designers, we could have done so much more. So here we are in 2021, and for many it feels like Groundhog Day. Students and staff were keen to get back onto campus. However, there was underlying uncertainty about how long that will be for. And this has often led to COVID whiplash for some. Contingencies are, of course, now the norm. Extensive evaluation of the student and staff experience of 2020 is now appearing in the literature. In the Australian context, it's clear that there have been both gains and losses in terms of the learning experience, and these should inform post-pandemic recovery and moving beyond the panicagogy of 2020. In terms of the positives, the flexibility and accessibility of remote learning has been a positive for some students, including those who may be ill or face difficulty in attending class regularly, but also for those who are based remotely, including offshore or students based in regional or remote communities. But there were also some losses, most notably the loss of community and interactions with peers and colleagues, and reduced engagement and motivation. So given the prolonged nature of the pandemic, we are unlikely to return to the pre-pandemic university environment. So then how do we best support our students to achieve success amongst this ongoing uncertainty?
Thanks, Christine. So I'm going to talk about this from a little bit of some theory grounded in ecology. I'm an ecologist by training, And when we think about these disturbances or these repeated disturbances that are happening, the first thing that came to my mind was thinking about the concept of resilience. So here we have the classic ball and cup model of resilience, where you have a ball and it gets disturbed one way or another and moves back and forth within the cup until you have this change or force that's big enough to push it out of its cup and into this alternative stable state. So it can move around in its new cup, but it isn't necessarily going to go back to how it was before the pandemic. So this brings us to the concept of hysteresis. And hysteresis means that you can have a change that happens in an environment or in a system, in this case, in our education system. But once that stress has been removed, it doesn't actually mean that you're going to plot a reciprocal course along the same pathway. So you have some steps that are taken to adapt to learning to lockdown, but the return back to this no lockdown environment is going to be fundamentally different because of this alternative stable state that we currently now live in. And so then we start thinking about resilience and what builds resilience in systems. So this is going way back to my passion, which as a marine ecologist, is thinking about natural systems and what is it that promotes resilience in a natural system. And one of those things is biodiversity. So in one diagram here, you have their classic food chain. So you have a plant being eaten by a primary consumer, a secondary consumer, and going to a tertiary consumer. But then let's say you have a loss of one of your consumers. So then you end up with sharks that have nothing to eat because, of course, they're not going to eat snails. So that's not a very resilient system for the environment. Now, on the other side here, we have a food web. And this food web, there's multiple primary, secondary, and tertiary consumers. And in this case, let's say you lose one secondary consumer and a primary consumer, you still have multiple pathways for your shark and your human to get their food. Now, how does all of this relate to a university system? So in a university, the classic system is you have a student, they have lectures, they have practicals, they go through and then they finish off their semester. But that's not a very resilient system. What happens when you lose your practicals because you have to go online? You solely rely on your lecture content to get you through, or maybe video, so it's maybe supplemental lecture content. But then what we've done in our university setting is we've built a more resilient system. So we have many options for the students to learn and to gain support. So let's say we have the pandemic happen, you lose practicals, students still have lectures. They still have our online chemistry clinic. They still have our peer learning facilitators that are embedded within the chemistry clinic and our kitchen lab program, which can be delivered face-to-face or online. So if we went back and we went and looked at the literature, it talks about how building a resilient system around the student is one way to take the pressure off the student. So instead of focusing on the individual student and the stresses that they may be having and helping to manage any of that personal stress or anxiety they may be feeling, we take that off of them and make it so that there's a resilient system that's there as padding or cushion around them to be able to adapt comfortably for them regardless of the situation around them.
Thanks, Dana. So now I'm just going to take you through an example of how we've built this resilient network for our science students at QUT. So we'll take you through each of the different options that we provide for our students to enable their learning. So first up, we have Kitchen Lab, which we discussed here last year as well. So this is a extracurricular program that we offer students, and it's embedded within major first year units that they take. And essentially the goal for this is to provide them with an authentic laboratory experience without the stress and the assessment that you typically find in a laboratory class. So you can see here we have students that are sitting around a regular classroom. However, they have laboratory equipment, they're performing a titration, and we guide them through that process of gathering experimental data, learning how to use the tools and working with it so they have their hands-on experience. Now, obviously, this is quite difficult to model in the online setting when we have a COVID lockdown, for example. So we have a version of this which allows students to perform these experiments at home by providing take-home experiment kits. So you can see them here. Again, we offer them everyday household items that you would find in your kitchen. So doing a titration with vinegar and bicarb, for example, and we pack that away, send it to the student with some online learning resources complementing that to scaffold the process for them. In addition to Kitchen Lab, we also run chemistry clinics. So chemistry, as being quite a central science, is important for a lot of our students starting off. And these sessions can be run face-to-face or online, and they're delivered in a way where it's flexible content provided depending on what the students' needs are. So we can cover any content that they're wishing to cover, whether it is for a chemistry unit specifically, or it's providing them with that base level knowledge for an applied unit. In addition to the chemistry clinics, we also have our peer learning facilitators that do a fantastic job with us. So these are students that are in their more senior years of their degree, and we've worked with them in the past, and they're fantastic individuals, really lovely, and they help us out at all of these different events that we offer. So they're embedded within our chemistry clinics, within Kitchen Lab, because as we know, one of the main things that's lost from the transitions that have occurred from COVID is that sense of community and belonging. And we're hoping that these PLFs can provide a little bit more of that. So you can see on the right here that we actually have them integrated on major Blackboard sites for student units where they can introduce themselves, give a little bit of advice for them, and they're able to cross-refer students over these different resources. So it creates a bit more of a web of support that students can access and use. So obviously this model looks fantastic in theory, but you're probably thinking, how efficient is this, right? And we think the same thing. It is a lot of work. So what we're hoping to shift towards in the future is to figure out how we can optimize this system depending on the specific environment. And to give you an example of what we're really interested in is looking at the differences between short, sharp lockdowns, like you see on the top here, where you have multiple transitions, versus more chronic shutdowns, which you might see in New South Wales, for example. And what we're hoping to model off this more quantitatively is how these differences in lockdown frequency and duration influence specific aspects of student success so that we can tailor our model to be a little bit more efficient in the future. But that's all we have for you today. So thank you very much for listening. And we'd like to acknowledge all of our different members of the Kitchen Lab team for this. So thank you.